15 million people fell silent over just 42 seconds of stillness on live television. Will Smith, one of Hollywood's most beloved icons, thought he was making a harmless joke at the expense of a quiet African president, Ibrahim Traoré, a man from a country most of the world ignores. But what happened next wasn't just unexpected. It was unforgettable. In front of the lights, the cameras, and the laughter, one man responded without raising his voice and left the world breathless. A single moment of dignity cut through decades of noise. Hollywood froze, a global audience wept, and Will Smith was changed. This is not just a story about fame and politics. It's about pride, perception, and the quiet power of truth. And while what you're about to witness is a dramatized reconstruction, a fictionalized account, the emotions it stirs, the questions it raises, and the reflections it awakens are deeply, undeniably real. So ask yourself, how can one man, armed with nothing but calm and conviction, shake the soul of millions without ever lifting his voice? The stage glowed under a canopy of lights, sharp, almost surgical in their clarity. The iconic blue and gold backdrop of Evening with Icons shimmered like a night sky made of velvet and spotlight. The audience was already electric, a sea of eager faces under the hum of air conditioning and anticipation. Phones were silenced, camera cranes hissed overhead, and somewhere backstage, a red countdown clock ticked its final seconds. 5, 4, 3, live in 3, 2, 1, cue the music, cue the thunderous applause, cue the performance. The host, dazzling in a tailored navy suit and practiced charisma, strode onto the stage like a conductor approaching his orchestra. He didn't need to say much. His smile was enough to ignite the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "tonight, you're in for something iconic." The camera cut to the famous couch, two men seated at opposite ends, as different as fire and still water. On the left, Will Smith, effortlessly magnetic, dressed in a sleek, cream-colored suit that caught the light with every movement. His posture was open, confident, the kind that said, "I've been here before." He flashed that world-famous grin, one part charm, one part calculation. The audience roared. This was their Will, the movie star, the king of charisma, the man who could turn pain into punchlines. On the right, President Ibrahim Traoré, quiet, poised, wearing a plain charcoal suit with no visible brand or flourish. No cufflinks, no tie pin, no designer polish, just fabric and presence. His hands rested gently on his knees. His posture was upright, but not stiff. His expression, hard to read, serene perhaps, or simply listening. The contrast was jarring. One side shimmered. The other seemed to absorb the noise around it. The audience wasn't sure what to make of him yet. A few leaned forward, curious. Who was this man? This leader from Burkina Faso, a nation many couldn't place on a map, sitting beside one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. The host broke the ice. "Will, you've played everything, from prince to legend to rebel. Ever thought about politics?" Will chuckled. "Man, if I ran for office, I'd have to go head to head with this guy right here." He gestured toward Traoré, flashing a grin. The audience laughed. The energy pulsed higher. Then the host leaned in, teasing, "Ooh, a style showdown?" "No offense, Mr. President, but Will might bring a little more sparkle to the White House." Will jumped in, eyes twinkling. "At least I'd bring some style to the table." "No offense, President Traoré, but your tailor looks like he gave up halfway through." Laughter erupted. It rolled through the room like a wave, relieved, entertained. "Easy," Traoré smiled politely. He didn't flinch. But in that brief second, the air shifted, almost imperceptibly. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The camera lingered on Traoré's face just half a second longer than usual. His eyes didn't dart. He didn't force a laugh. He simply waited. And the audience, still chuckling, didn't realize what was coming. The host moved on, but the room hadn't quite reset, because beneath the laughter, something had cracked open. A question, subtle but potent, started to form in the viewer's mind. Who is this man really? And why does his silence feel louder than the applause? Somewhere in the control room, a producer leaned forward slightly. He didn't know why, but something about that moment didn't feel like a joke anymore. The studio pulsed with energy, the kind of static excitement only a live broadcast could bring. The set sparkled under the lights, and for a moment, it felt like nothing in the world could go wrong. Laughter came easy, applause was automatic, and everyone in the room knew the rhythm. Setup, punchline, laugh. Repeat. The host leaned forward on the armrest, flashing a grin that had introduced 1,000 interviews. "Will," he began with playful curiosity, "you've done it all. Action, comedy, drama, even rap. But tell me this, ever thought of running for office?" The crowd stirred. It was an innocent question, or at least it seemed that way. Will's eyes lit up. He laughed, brushing his lapel like a politician dusting off a scandal. "Man, imagine me on a debate stage," he said. "I might not have the policies, but I definitely bring some flair." The host grinned wider, seizing the momentum. "Well, if you did run, I guess you'd be going up against our other guest tonight, President Traoré himself. Now that's a face-off I'd pay to see." Will chuckled again, nodding toward Traoré. Then he paused, tilted his head, and delivered the line with expert timing. "At least I'd bring some style to the table. No offense, Mr. President, but your tailor looks like he gave up halfway through." Boom! The audience burst out laughing, loud, uninhibited, collective. The kind of laugh that filled a room and gave everyone permission to relax. Even the host let out a cackle, leaning back in his chair, tapping his note cards against his knee. It was the perfect late-night moment, the charming celebrity, the unexpected jab, the roaring laughter. But then, the camera cut to President Ibrahim Traoré. He was still smiling politely. His hands remained gently folded on his lap. He hadn't moved. His eyes, dark, calm, looked first at Will, then briefly to the audience, then returned to stillness. He didn't laugh. He didn't shift in his seat. And somehow, that silence was deafening. No one in the crowd noticed it at first. The laughter masked it. But to anyone watching closely, especially those in the production booth, and especially the floor director, it was clear something hadn't quite landed the way it should have. The host, sensing the high, tried to keep the momentum going. "Come on, Will, better be careful. He might not look flashy, but presidents know how to play the long game." More chuckles, but lighter this time. Will, still smiling, adjusted in his seat, glancing at Traoré. "You good, Mr. President?" he asked, a faint thread of sincerity woven under the humor. Traoré nodded gently. "Of course." That was all he said, but the way he said it, measured even, unwavering, wasn't defensive. It wasn't playful. It was whole, centered, as if nothing had been shaken inside him, as if that moment of ridicule had hit a wall that absorbed it completely, then returned nothing back. And somehow, that was more unsettling than any retort. The energy on stage began to shift, subtly but surely. It was as if the air had thickened, as if some invisible weight had been placed in the middle of the room. The laughter faded, but the silence that followed didn't feel natural. It felt like a pause that no one was ready to fill. The audience didn't know what to do. Their eyes darted between Will and Traoré, hoping for another joke, another cue, something to tell them that everything was still okay. But no cue came. The host cleared his throat and shuffled his cards. "Well, things just got presidential," he said, forcing a grin. Another ripple of laughter, but this one landed flat. Will leaned back slightly, blinking slowly. His smile remained, but only on the surface. Beneath it, something had shifted. He didn't know exactly why, but for the first time in the night, he felt like he'd misread the room. And it wasn't because the joke had bombed. It hadn't. The audience had laughed. The host had laughed. He had landed it clean. But it was Traoré's response, or rather the lack of one, that disturbed something deeper. Because when a man refuses to react, when he meets ridicule with stillness, when he smiles without retreating and holds his ground without pushing back, something about that unnerves people. It makes you wonder what strength he's hiding. It makes you question what he sees that you don't. And even though no one in the audience could put their finger on it yet, a quiet thought had begun forming in the back of their minds. Maybe the joke wasn't on him at all. Maybe the real story was about to begin. The last echoes of laughter fizzled out like champagne bubbles at the rim of an abandoned glass. The host, sensing the temperature drop, shuffled his note cards. A production assistant coughed somewhere in the shadows. In the hush that followed, President Ibrahim Traoré did something almost imperceptible yet arresting. He leaned back, laced his fingers loosely, and fixed his gaze on Will Smith with a steadiness that felt older than the cameras pointed at him. No muscle in his face twitched. No defensive smile returned. He simply was. Present, anchored, immovable. Seconds stretched. The audience, still perched on the edge of collective amusement, realized there would be no punchline to release them. The room tightened. You could hear the distant tremor of an LED light rig and the slow exhale of the air conditioning vents. Traoré drew in a measured breath, not to speak louder, but to make the silence even more exact. His eyes stayed locked on Will's, not aggressive, not pleading, just seeing him in a way few people ever dared to see a star. When he finally spoke, his voice was linen soft, threaded with calm authority. "I don't wear power, Will," he said, every syllable deliberate, almost intimate. "I carry it." The sentence landed with the weight of a gavel on velvet. No slam, just finality. Some truths don't need volume. They shine by contrast. And in that moment, the bright suit, the practiced grin, the Hollywood aura all seemed to dim around Will, as if Traoré's words had gently pulled the current from the spotlight. The audience inhaled collectively. Some didn't even notice they'd been holding their breath. A woman in the second row pressed her hand to her chest. A man beside her lowered his phone, forgetting the Instagram story he had meant to capture. Even the host, master of segues and smooth recoveries, blinked twice and found no safe joke to bridge the widening gulf on stage. Will's confidence began to unravel in tiny visible threads. His trademark smile wavered, then faltered altogether. He shifted, crossed one leg over the other, uncrossed it again. The stage lights, once flattering, now revealed a sheen of vulnerability across his brow. He tried to summon a response, a quip, a nod, anything, but words clung to the back of his throat like wet leaves. All he could manage was a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, as if conceding ground he'd never planned to defend. The cameras, guided by an instinct older than storytelling, pushed in. A tight shot framed Will's face just as moisture pooled at the corner of his eye. One tear escaped, carving a silent path down his cheek before he could blink it back. It wasn't cinematic bravado. It was a reflex, raw and unguarded. Somewhere in the control room, a producer whispered, "Hold that shot, hold it," because they all knew. The real story had arrived. Traoré didn't gloat, didn't press the moment for advantage. He simply inclined his head as though acknowledging a truth shared between them. That strength sometimes looks like stillness, and that dignity can speak louder than any roar. The auditorium sat suspended in that revelation, a collective recognition that something immense had just shifted, not in the noise of the show, but in the quiet that followed. The laughter didn't follow him backstage. Will Smith stepped off the set and into the dim corridor behind the studio, the applause still echoing faintly in the distance. But back here, behind the curtains and cameras, the energy was different, thinner, quieter, unsettled. A stagehand offered him a bottle of water, which he took without speaking. He unscrewed the cap slowly, then sat down on a worn leather couch just out of view. The cushions sighed beneath him, as if even they were tired of pretending. He took a long sip. The water was room temperature, but it cooled his throat, now dry with something he couldn't name. Fatigue? Embarrassment? Something heavier? Around him, crew members moved with purposeful silence. Cables were coiled, lights dimmed, clipboards stacked. There were no celebratory nods, no backstage banter. A few people glanced at him, but quickly looked away, as though afraid to intrude on a moment they didn't fully understand. A young production assistant, no older than 25, whispered to another crew member near the monitor banks. "He wasn't trying to be cruel, was he?" The other shrugged. "I don't think so, but damn." Neither of them realized their voices had carried far enough for Will to hear. He didn't flinch, didn't react, just stared at the water bottle in his hand like it might hold an answer. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, almost mournfully. Someone's phone vibrated on a nearby table. No one picked it up. In another part of the studio, a junior editor had already flagged the 90-second segment for clipping. The switcher team had isolated the camera angle on Traoré's face. The stillness, the precision of his words, the moment Will blinked in response, visibly disarmed. The silence, the tear. The caption was quick and clean. Will Smith humbled on live TV by African president's powerful words. Before midnight, it was uploaded to the show's official channel. Before 1 a.m., it had crossed 100,000 views. Will leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, head hanging just low enough to shield his eyes. He was still in the same suit, still had makeup lightly brushed along his jawline. But the persona, the ease, the polish, the performance, had peeled back, and he wasn't sure what was underneath. Traoré hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't corrected him, scolded him, or returned the joke. But somehow what he said had cut deeper than any sharp retort. "I don't wear power, Will. I carry it." The words looped again and again in his mind. Not loud, but insistent. Like an echo not from the room, but from inside. He'd been on thousands of stages. He'd heard louder audiences, wilder reactions, tougher interviews. He'd handled controversy, criticism, even scandal. But this wasn't about reputation. It was about something else, something closer to worth. He closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw flashes. His joke landing, the crowd's laughter, and then Traoré's eyes. Unblinking, calm, not angry, just seeing him. Not the actor, not the comedian, just him. For a moment, Will wished he could go back. Not to take the joke back, necessarily, but to see it coming from the other side. From the eyes of a man who didn't have the luxury of laughter when lives depended on his every decision. A man who wore no mask, yet commanded respect with nothing more than stillness. In the hallway, the clip had already been shared by several verified accounts. Celebrities, influencers, political commentators. One tweet read, "Will came with charm. Traoré came with truth." Another, "This wasn't just a clapback. This was a masterclass in presence." The algorithm had picked it up. The wave was rising. But Will wasn't thinking about views. Not yet. He sat back against the couch, eyes unfocused, the studio suddenly feeling far too bright. He hadn't just misread the room. He'd misread the man. And now, for the first time in a long time, Will Smith wasn't sure what role to play next. Because the script had shifted, and he wasn't the one writing it anymore. By sunrise, the internet was on fire. The 90-second clip from Evening with Icons had leapt from the show's official page onto every major social media platform within hours. On YouTube, it surged past 1 million views before most of the world had eaten breakfast. On TikTok, edits multiplied by the minute, some focusing on Will's tear, others on Traoré's unshaken calm. Instagram Reels echoed the moment like digital gospel. Twitter, now a battlefield of real-time opinion and instant judgment, was ablaze. But what surprised everyone wasn't just the speed of the virality, it was the tone. This wasn't mockery. This wasn't drama for the sake of spectacle. What people saw, what they felt, was something rare, something real. A top comment under the original clip read, "This wasn't a clapback. It was wisdom wrapped in grace." Another, "He didn't humiliate Will. He humanized him, and all of us." And another in all caps, "I've never seen a man crush an ego without raising his voice." Screenshots of Traoré's face during the moment, calm, composed, clear-eyed, began circulating like modern-day icons. Some users overlaid his quote on black and white stills from the clip, "I don't wear power, I carry it." Others turned the moment into, quote, graphics, wallpapers, even temporary tattoos. Memes, yes, but reverent ones. No filters, no sarcasm, just admiration. Across time zones, cultural lines, and political affiliations, the video was igniting conversations not just about Will or Traoré, but about dignity, about presence, about what real strength actually looks like in a world trained to respond with volume. By midday, it had reached universities. A philosophy professor at Cambridge paused her lecture on leadership ethics to play the clip. Observe, she told her class, how restraint holds more power than retaliation. In a high school in Lagos, a teacher played it for her students during morning assembly. This, she said, is how you carry yourself when the world expects you to stumble. In a mosque in Jakarta, a Friday sermon quoted the scene as an example of emotional intelligence. The prophet taught us that silence can be more powerful than speech. Today, a president reminded the world of that. In a church in Atlanta, the pastor played the clip before his sermon. The congregation sat in stunned silence. One congregant wept. Another whispered, "That man, he speaks like scripture." Meanwhile, on Reddit, a thread titled "The Moment Will Smith Got Humbled, and the World Needed It" hit the front page in under an hour. Users from dozens of countries shared personal anecdotes about times they'd been mocked and how they wished they'd had Traoré's calm. One user wrote, "I've been silent before, but out of fear." He was silent out of strength. That's different. The firestorm spread not through outrage, but through reverence. Even news outlets, typically slow to spotlight African leaders unless crisis or conflict was involved, were taking notice. Headlines range from "the president who spoke without roaring" to "how Ibrahim Traoré quietly taught the world a lesson." But perhaps the most striking line came from a cultural commentator on a primetime panel show. She leaned forward and said slowly, "He disarmed Hollywood with humility. That's not just rare, that's revolutionary." No one argued. Somewhere in California, Will Smith sat alone, watching the ripples of a moment he hadn't meant to create. In the beginning, it had felt like just another segment. One more laugh, one more line. But now the laughter had become background noise to something much deeper. Something unspoken but resounding. He scrolled through the comments in silence, then paused at one. "We all thought we came to watch a star shine. Turns out we watched a man stand." Will put the phone down. For the first time in a long time, the mirror he'd held up to the world was reflecting something back at him. Not applause, but awareness. And it was only just beginning. The hotel room was dark, save for the glow of Will's phone screen. Outside the window, the city lights pulsed like distant thoughts. Loud, scattered, unaware. Inside, the silence felt heavy, but not oppressive. It was the kind of silence that asked to be listened to. Will sat at the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched, thumbs hovering above the screen. He had watched the clip 5 times already. 6 if he counted the muted replay. Each time he caught something new, something he hadn't noticed before. The flicker in Traoré's eyes, the absence of tension in his shoulders, the way he had waited for the laughter to die before speaking, as if he respected silence more than attention. Will knew performance. He had lived in it, breathed it, worn it like second skin for decades. He knew the rhythm of a good moment, the setup, the delivery, the pause for effect. But this wasn't that. This wasn't performance. This was presence. And for the first time in a very long time, Will realized he wasn't the one telling the story anymore. He was being told about, studied, dissected, felt. In that clip, it wasn't the camera that had exposed him. It was the contrast. His charm had always been a shield, a rhythm people adored. But Traoré had stepped in with no armor, no rhythm, just truth. Soft, but unshakable. Will rewound to the exact moment Traoré said, "I don't wear power. I carry it." He paused the frame, staring into the still image of the man's face. There was no judgment in it, no triumph, just clarity. His phone buzzed. A message. He blinked, breaking from the image. It was from his mother. "You've made movies, baby, but tonight you made meaning." He read it again, slower this time. A warmth rose in his chest, part pain, part pride. She wasn't praising the joke. She wasn't praising the tears. She was naming the moment for what it truly was. A crack in the surface, where something real had finally shone through. Will let the phone rest on the bedside table. He sat there for another long minute, still, unblinking. Then almost instinctively, he reached for his phone again, this time not to scroll but to create. He opened the Notes app. Blank, white, waiting. He hadn't written like this in years. Not lines for a character, not speeches for interviews. Just words, his own, without filters or edits, without a punchline or a purpose other than truth. His fingers hesitated above the keyboard, then moved. Tonight I saw myself from the outside, and I didn't like all of it. He paused, deleted the last line, rewrote it. And I needed to. The cursor blinked back at him. No applause, no audience. Just him. And for once, that was enough. In a small hospital room tucked into the quiet corners of Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the world was shrinking for 11-year-old Muna. The sterile white walls, the beeping of machines, the whispers of nurses. This had been her universe for months. Leukemia had taken much from her already. Her strength, her hair, her appetite for mango candy, and her days in the sun. But not her spirit. Not yet. That evening, the glow from a small tablet screen lit her face. Her mother, seated beside her, scrolled through videos while holding her daughter's delicate hand. She had intended to find something light, perhaps cartoons or a funny clip. But her finger paused on a thumbnail showing Will Smith and a man in a plain gray suit seated on a talk show stage. The title read, "Will Smith Mocked Him." His response left the world speechless. Curious, she tapped. For the next 90 seconds, the room forgot its sickness. The noise from the machines faded behind Traoré's voice. Gentle, unwavering, full of something Muna couldn't name, but deeply recognized. She watched the clip unfold, the joke, the laughter, the stillness that followed. Then the words, "I don't wear power, I carry it." She didn't fully understand what that meant, but it felt like truth. It felt like love. When the video ended, her mother glanced down, expecting to find her daughter half asleep again. But Muna's eyes were wide, shining. "He's not like other presidents," she whispered. "He speaks like a papa." Her mother smiled, brushing a loose scarf back over Muna's head. "Yes, Cherie, he does." Muna sat up slowly, her small body trembling with the effort. "Can I write him something?" she asked. "Just to say thank you?" Her mother hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." A nurse found a piece of hospital stationery and a pen. Muna leaned over the tray table, her handwriting small, shaky, but determined. "Dear President Traoré, I saw you on the video. When you talked, I forgot my pain for a moment. You made me feel proud to be from Burkina Faso. You didn't shout. You didn't laugh back. You spoke like a real papa. I wish I could hug you. Thank you. Love, Muna." She held the paper in her hands like something sacred. Her mother, moved by the simplicity of the moment, took a photo of the letter and posted it to social media with a short caption. "My daughter has days left, but tonight she forgot her pain. She wants to thank her president." Within hours, the post began to spread, first among local communities, then among larger African pages. By morning, it had been shared by journalists, artists, even international humanitarian groups. The image of a little girl's handwritten note traveled across continents, fragile but powerful. People from Kenya to Canada left comments. "I'm crying. This is what leadership looks like." How can one sentence bring such peace to a child? "Muna, you're braver than all of us." The hashtag letter to Traoré began trending. But Muna didn't care about hashtags. She just wanted to know if the president had seen her words. That night, as her mother tucked her in and gently adjusted the IV line at her arm, Muna whispered, "Do you think he'll write back?" Her mother smiled softly. "I think he'll do more than that." And in a quiet room across the ocean, deep inside the Burkina Embassy in New York City, President Ibrahim Traoré sat in silence, holding a printed copy of that very letter. He didn't speak at first. He simply read it, once, then again. Then he stood, folded the letter carefully, and said to his aide, "Cancel the next meeting. I need to call a little girl." And something in his voice broke gently, like a man who just remembered what real power was for. The ambassador's office in New York was quiet, dignified, heavy curtains drawn against the city skyline, polished wood reflecting warm yellow lamplight. Aides whispered in low tones, phones buzzed occasionally, documents slid across desks in urgent silence. But in one corner of the room, everything had stopped. President Ibrahim Traoré stood at the window, holding a single sheet of paper. The letter was small, only a few lines in a child's trembling hand, but its weight pressed into his chest like a stone. He had read it 3 times. Each time something different had pierced him. The line about pain, the word papa, the simplicity of her wish. He closed his eyes, inhaled through his nose, and without turning around, spoke softly to his aide. "Cancel my next meeting," he said. "Please, I need to make a call." His aide didn't question it. He simply nodded and began tapping on a tablet to clear the schedule. Traoré moved to the desk, sat down, and gently picked up the phone. A direct line was patched to the hospital room in Ouagadougou. The connection clicked. 1 ring, 2. In the pediatric wing of the hospital, the phone startled everyone. Muna's mother looked at the nurse, who hesitated, then answered. "Yes, hello?" The voice on the other end was warm, clear, composed. "Madame," he said in French accented English, "this is President Ibrahim Traoré. May I speak to your daughter, please?" The nurse's hand flew to her mouth. Muna's mother froze. For a moment, no one moved. Then Muna, weak but alert, sat up a little straighter. "Is it him?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Her mother handed her the receiver with shaking hands. "Muna?" the voice said again, softer now. "It's really me." There was a long pause. Are you really the man from the video?" she asked, her voice fragile, almost scared to believe it. Traoré chuckled gently. "Yes, little one. But more importantly, I'm your friend." Muna's mouth opened in surprise, and then something miraculous happened. She laughed. It was a laugh through pain, thin and breathless, but real, her first genuine laugh in months. Her mother clutched a tissue, eyes filling. The nurse stepped back, wiping her own tears discreetly. "I liked what you said," Muna told him. "You didn't get mad. You just talked like someone kind, like someone who sees people." Traoré's voice cracked just slightly. "That's because I do see people, Muna, especially brave ones, like you." She giggled again, her small fingers clenching the phone tighter. "Do you want to know my favorite color?" "I would love to." "Blue, but not the sad kind, the sky kind." He smiled, jotting it down on the paper beside him as if it were a state secret. "Sky blue. That's a very good kind. And my favorite food is mango ice cream, even though I can't eat much now." "Mango ice cream," he repeated, voice tender. "Maybe when you feel better, we'll share some together. How about that?" Muna's voice dropped to a whisper. "You promise?" "I promise," he said, as if sealing it with his soul. There was silence for a few seconds. Then she added quietly, "Everyone thinks you're strong because you're president, but I think you're strong because you listen." Traoré closed his eyes, fighting back the emotion swelling in his throat. "You," he replied, "have done something most adults cannot. You reminded the world what kindness sounds like." He paused, then continued, his voice barely above a breath. "You are stronger than me, Muna." The words hung there, fragile, reverent, true. After a few more exchanges, talking about books, her favorite flower, the bird she once saw from her window, they said goodbye. Muna handed the phone back, her fingers trembling, but her smile radiant. When the call ended, Traoré sat in stillness for a long while. He looked out at the bustling city beyond the glass, cars honking, screens flashing, people hurrying, and all he could see was a small hospital room thousands of miles away, where a little girl had reminded him why he chose to lead. Not for the cameras, not for applause, but for this, for the moments when humanity whispers and a leader finally listens. The video of Muna's phone call with President Traoré, posted quietly by a nurse with trembling hands, did not just go viral, it ignited something deeper, quieter, and far more enduring than a trend. Within hours, the footage was translated into French, English, Arabic, Portuguese, and Swahili. But it wasn't the words that carried it. It was the silence between them, the stillness of a leader who spoke not from a podium, but from the heart. In classrooms in Senegal, teachers printed Muna's letter and handed it out for students to read aloud. In a small village in Nepal, a group of children watched the video on a cracked tablet and began drawing pictures of the president who listens. In Brazil, a choir of school kids sang a lullaby and dedicated it to Muna, the girl who made the world kinder. Letters began pouring in, from children in Morocco, Korea, Nigeria, Canada, handwritten, typed, dictated. Some were colorful, decorated with stars and hearts. Others were simple, folded sheets bearing small, honest messages. Thank you for making us feel seen. Or, I want to be kind like Muna and brave like you. Traoré's team could barely keep up. The mailroom at the embassy transformed into a collage of global compassion. But the president insisted every letter would be opened, every word read. One morning in the quiet of his private office, he sat with a bundle of these letters stacked in front of him. He read slowly, carefully, as if each sentence deserved its own breath. His aide knocked gently, but didn't enter. There were meetings waiting, interviews scheduled, headlines to respond to. But Traoré didn't look up. Instead, he lingered on a quote someone had printed inside one of the envelopes, a clipping from an article written by a novelist in London. In an age of noise, one man whispered and the world paused. He read it again, softer this time, almost to himself. His eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, life went on. Cars moved, people passed, horns blared, but none of it reached him. Not really. He laid the letter down and pressed his fingers together in quiet thought. This is not about TV anymore, he said finally. Not to anyone in particular, just to the room, to the air, to himself. He realized then that the moment between him and Muna, between him and Will Smith, between him and the silence in that studio, was no longer just a moment. It had become a mirror. And the world wasn't just watching it. The world was reflecting through it and beginning, somehow, to change. The walk home always felt longer when Marcus had been laughed at. 12 years old and small for his age, he usually kept his head down, backpack slung low, hoping to move through the school day without being noticed. But today, like too many others, he hadn't been invisible enough. It started in gym class. One of the boys pointed at his sneakers, worn, scuffed, and split at the sides. The sole of the right shoe flapped slightly when he walked, a quiet betrayal he couldn't hide. "Yo, Marcus," a boy sneered. "Your shoes got more holes than your lunch money." Laughter followed, not loud but sharp, slicing. Teachers didn't see, or pretended not to. Marcus didn't answer. He never did. He had learned early that silence was safer than reaction. When the bell rang, he walked home in the cold. New York wind brushing against the cuffs of his too-short jacket. His mother worked 2 jobs, did the best she could. He never blamed her. But the city didn't care about reasons. It only noticed appearances. As he reached their building, his steps slowed. 4th floor, no elevator. He climbed quietly, entered the apartment, and closed the door with a soft thud that sounded heavier than it should. His mom was already in the kitchen, still in her nursing scrubs. She turned, saw his face, and said nothing. She didn't need to. She poured water into the kettle and set 2 cups on the table. Chamomile for him, black tea for her. It was their quiet ritual, comfort without questions. Marcus sat, still wearing his coat, shoulders hunched. His mom slid the mug in front of him. "Rough day?" He nodded. "Want to talk?" He shook his head. She didn't push. Instead, she reached for her phone, opened a video a friend had sent her earlier that day, and let it play on the kitchen table between them. It was a talk show. 2 men on a couch, one familiar, the other not. Will Smith and someone else. A president, apparently, from Africa, Burkina Faso. She didn't expect Marcus to watch, but he did. The clip unfolded. The joke, the laughter, the stillness, and then the voice. "I don't wear power," the man said. "I carry it." And then, a little later, "The world doesn't need louder men. It needs quieter hearts." Marcus blinked. Something in him stilled. The words didn't hit him like a punch. They arrived like a slow warmth, rising through the cold shell of the day. He reached for the phone, replayed the clip. Again, then again, 10 times. Each time the noise of school, of jeers, of the flap of his torn shoe seemed to dull just a little more. His mom sat beside him, watching, not the screen, but her son. She hadn't seen him this still in weeks. "You like him?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "He talks quiet, but people listen." Hmm. Hmm. There was a pause. "He sounds like someone who wouldn't laugh at my shoes," Marcus said, almost a whisper. His mother reached for his hand. "He sounds like someone who'd see what you're carrying." Marcus didn't speak again that night, but before bed he took out the old notebook he kept under his pillow, the one no one knew about, the one with sketches and sentences that didn't always make sense. He opened to a fresh page and wrote slowly, "Today I was laughed at." I didn't scream. I remembered his voice. That made me feel strong. He folded the page, tucked it between the notebook's covers, and slipped it back under his pillow. Then he turned out the light. And for the first time in weeks, he slept through the night. Morning light poured through the cracked blinds, casting stripes of gold and shadow across Marcus's small bedroom. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint rattle of the radiator and the gentle clinking of dishes from the kitchen, where his mother was making breakfast before her early shift. But Marcus didn't move. He lay still in bed, staring up at the ceiling, one hand resting gently on the thin notebook tucked beneath his pillow. His secret place. The page he'd written the night before still felt warm in his mind. "I was laughed at. I didn't scream. I remembered your voice. It made me strong." Those words had come easily when the world around him was finally quiet. In the silence, he hadn't felt weak or small. He had felt seen, even if only by a man on a screen who would never know his name. But now, in the bright honesty of morning, Marcus felt a different kind of heaviness. What would someone like President Traoré do with a letter like his? Would he even read it? Would it be tossed aside, lost in a sea of more important words? Marcus slid the notebook out, flipped it open, and reread the short letter. He didn't change a thing. It was simple, but it was true, and that made it feel heavier than any essay or journal he'd ever written for school. He considered showing it to his mother, but stopped. Not because he didn't trust her, but because this felt like something just his. Something raw, like the soft part of a fruit that bruises too easily. At school that day, the teasing didn't come. Not because it had disappeared, but because Marcus had started to walk differently. Not faster or taller, but steadier. He didn't flinch when someone snorted at his shoes. He didn't look away when a group whispered. He kept his eyes forward and carried himself as though he had something none of them could take. And in a way, he did. He had a voice in his head now. Traoré's voice. The world doesn't need louder men. It needs quieter hearts. Back home that evening, Marcus went straight to his room. He opened the notebook again, reading his letter once more. Then he took out a clean envelope from his school supplies, gently folded the page and slipped it inside. He didn't seal it. Not yet. He wasn't ready. Instead, he wrote on the front in small, careful print, "To President Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso." He stared at it for a long time, the way someone stares at a map and wonders how far is too far to be believed. Could words travel across oceans? Could a small voice be heard by someone whose words had already moved millions? That night, he tucked the envelope back under his pillow, not to hide it, but to let it rest, like something that might one day wake up on its own and find its way. His mother peeked into the room as he was climbing into bed. "You doing okay today?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, I wrote something. Can I see?" He hesitated, then offered a small smile. "Maybe later." She respected that. She kissed his forehead and turned off the light. As Marcus lay there, his hand resting gently on the letter beneath his pillow, he didn't know whether he would send it. He didn't know if the world would care. But he knew this. Writing it had changed something. The sadness was still there. The shoes still had holes. But somewhere between his words and the silence that followed, Marcus had found a piece of peace. And sometimes that's all a boy needs to begin healing. One sentence, one voice, and the courage to speak back, even if only to himself. In the soft morning quiet of the Burkina Embassy in New York, President Ibrahim Traoré sat behind his desk, a fresh stack of letters beside him. Most were from adults, journalists, professors, politicians, each analyzing, dissecting, praising his recent appearance. But near the bottom of the pile was one envelope, slightly creased, addressed in a boy's careful handwriting. To President Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso. His assistant had nearly passed it over, assuming it was another fan letter. But something about it, the simplicity, the handwriting, caught her attention. She handed it to him without comment. Traoré read slowly. I was laughed at, but I didn't scream. I remembered your voice. It made me strong. He sat still for a long moment, his eyes resting on the words. The world outside the window was waking up, full of meetings, agendas, expectations. But in that moment, all of it faded behind the clarity of one truth, whispered from the heart of a 12-year-old boy in Harlem. He looked up at his aide and said, almost to himself, we lead nations, but sometimes we just need to hold one child's pain. There was no hesitation. Get me a direct line, he said, to the school or his home, wherever he is. An hour later, in a quiet school counselor's office in Harlem, Marcus sat nervously in a chair far too big for him. He'd been pulled from class without warning, unsure if he was in trouble, unsure of anything at all. His hands fidgeted in his lap. Then the counselor entered, holding out a phone. There's someone who wants to speak to you, she said, eyes shimmering. Marcus took the phone, pressed it to his ear, and whispered, Hello? The voice on the other end was unmistakable. Marcus, said President Traoré, warm and steady. This is Ibrahim Traoré. I read your letter. Silence, then a sharp intake of breath. Marcus's throat tightened. His eyes welled up. For a moment he couldn't speak. Traoré continued, his voice soft. You gave me hope today, Marcus. And hope is the quietest kind of strength. Marcus pressed the phone tighter. A single tear slipped down his cheek. Not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, just the quiet, shaking kind that comes when someone finally sees you. I didn't think you'd ever hear it, Marcus said, voice breaking. But I did, Traoré replied, and I won't forget it. There were no grand speeches, no rehearsed words, just a boy and a president on opposite sides of the world, connected by something rare, recognition. And for the first time in his life, Marcus didn't feel small. He felt heard, and sometimes that's more powerful than anything fame or fortune could ever offer. The air in Ouagadougou was thick with dust and sunlight when the unmarked plane touched down. No press corps waited on the tarmac, no red carpet, no staged handshakes. Just heat, wind, and the soft rumble of airport machinery in the distance. The figure who stepped off the plane wore a plain gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and a worn cap pulled low over his eyes. No entourage, no sunglasses, no cameras. Will Smith had come alone. He carried only a duffel bag, a folded piece of paper in his back pocket, and a weight he hadn't been able to shake since that night under the studio lights. The moment had gone viral. The internet had processed it 1,000 different ways. But Will hadn't come here for headlines. He came because something in him was still echoing, and he needed to be in the presence of the silence that caused it. At the edge of the tarmac, Ibrahim Traoré stood waiting. Not in a suit, not flanked by aides, not guarded by motorcades. Just a white button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a soft nod as Will approached. His shoes were dusty. His posture was relaxed. The only hint of authority was in the calmness of his eyes. Will reached out a hand. Traoré took it, and for a moment, they didn't say anything. Then the president smiled gently. Didn't expect Hollywood to come so humbly. Will managed a quiet laugh. Neither did Hollywood. No photos were taken, no formal statements. They drove in a modest government vehicle through streets lined with vendors, motorbikes, and the scent of grilled meat and diesel. No one recognized Will at first, not dressed like this, not without the usual shield of celebrity, but those who did simply nodded, curious but unintrusive. Their destination wasn't a palace or a government building, it was a school, a small primary school on the outskirts of the city where kids chased each other in the dust, their laughter rising over the rustling of tree leaves. Under the broad shade of a tamarind tree, the two men sat side by side on a worn wooden bench. In front of them, a group of children played football with a half-flat ball, oblivious to the history quietly unfolding just meters away. Will watched them, elbows on his knees, fingers laced together. They don't even know who I am. They know joy, Traoré said, following Will's gaze. That's more important today. Will nodded slowly. You said something on that stage I haven't been able to forget. About power, about carrying it. Traoré didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached down, picked up a pebble, and tossed it lightly into the dirt. You know why I come here? He asked, voice soft. Will shook his head. Because leadership doesn't grow in conference halls. It grows here, Traoré said. In playgrounds, in the silence between laughter, in the eyes of children who haven't yet been told they can't change the world. Will sat back. The sounds of the children mixed with the rustle of wind through the tree's branches, creating a music more honest than any soundtrack he'd ever heard. He pulled the folded paper from his back pocket, held it for a moment, then handed it to Traoré. What is it? The president asked, unfolding it carefully. A list, Will replied, of apologies. People I owe them to. Some I've hurt. Some I ignored. Some I never gave the space to be seen. Traoré read silently, then folded the paper once more, placed it beside him on the bench, and said nothing. Because sometimes the deepest acknowledgments don't need praise, just witness. They sat there, two men from different worlds, neither performing, neither posturing, just being. And beneath that tree, surrounded by dust, laughter, and the kind of peace that doesn't announce itself, Will Smith finally understood why he'd come, not to explain himself, but to listen. The folded paper sat between them on the bench like something sacred, fragile, and long overdue. It was crumpled slightly at the edges, soft from being handled too many times, the creases worn in like lines on a weary face. Will didn't rush to explain it. He just watched as Traoré opened the page, eyes scanning names handwritten in dark blue ink. First names, last names, initials. No dates, no explanations, just people. This is a list, Will said quietly, of those I've hurt. Some directly, some by silence, some with words I thought were jokes, others just by not being there when I should have been. Traoré kept reading. Will continued, his voice low but steady. Fame gave me a megaphone before I learned how to use my voice. Pain gave me armor before I understood what needed protecting. And pride, well, that just kept me from looking back. He paused, exhaling. I carried this list in my mind for years. It started as guilt. Then it became shame. Eventually, I convinced myself it was too late to say anything. But something you said, that night, cracked it open. Traoré looked up. Will met his gaze. You said you don't wear power, you carry it, and I realized I've been wearing everything. Image, success, smiles, but not carrying anything real, not responsibility, not ownership, not healing. The moment hung suspended in the warm Burkina Faso air, the laughter of children drifting in the distance like a reminder of how simple life used to be before it became complicated. Traoré folded the paper carefully and rested it in his lap. His eyes didn't waver. You know, he said slowly, people think healing is about saying the right words at the right time. Public statements, headlines, grand gestures, but it's not. He looked out toward the schoolyard. Healing begins not when we fix the world, he said, but when we speak truth to ourselves, not polished truth, not what sounds wise, just the kind that feels like a mirror. Will nodded slowly, his eyes moistening. That's the hardest part, isn't it? Looking and not flinching. It is, Traoré said, but it's also the beginning of peace. They sat in silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, the honest kind, the kind that stretches wide enough to hold sorrow, regret, and hope all at once. I don't expect to fix what I broke, Will admitted, but I don't want to run from it anymore. I'm tired of making peace with my image. I want to make peace with myself. Traoré placed a hand gently over the folded list. Then this, he said, is already more than apology. It's invitation to live differently. Will breathed in deeply, the kind of breath that feels like the first one after holding too much inside. A gust of wind passed through the branches above, scattering dry leaves across their feet. Neither man moved to brush them away. Some things, they seemed to agree, are better left unhurried. And in that moment, two men from opposite worlds sat not as a Hollywood star and a president, but as human beings. laying burdens down not in speeches, but in shared silence. The breeze stirred gently through the dusty courtyard, and the light shifted just enough for the shadows under the tamarind tree to stretch a little farther. Will and Traoré remained seated, the folded list of apologies still resting quietly between them. Children's laughter echoed nearby, unbothered by significance, unbothered by the weight of two men wrestling with truth. Then, without warning, a little girl with bare feet and a sun-worn dress approached. Her hair was braided neatly, eyes wide with curiosity. She held something small in her hands, a single wildflower, yellow and delicate, picked from the edge of the school fence. She stepped closer to Will, who noticed her only when she stopped directly in front of him. She didn't speak. She simply looked up and held out the flower. Will's heart caught in his chest. He blinked slowly, and a smile, unforced, unfiltered, spread across his face. He dropped gently to one knee, not to be dramatic, not to be seen, but simply to meet her at eye level. He accepted the flower with both hands, as if it were a crown, and said softly, "Thank you." The girl giggled, turned, and ran back into the noise of play. Will remained kneeling for a moment longer, and in that stillness, something subtle but irrevocable happened. It wasn't the camera-ready grin or the poised charm of a star. It was a smile of someone who, for the first time in a long time, felt more human than famous. Across town, in a weathered barber shop on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a group of young men gathered around a flickering television screen. The shop was old, faded posters on the wall, cracked leather chairs, clippers that buzzed just a little louder than they should. But this afternoon, no one was cutting hair. They were watching a clip, that clip again. On screen, Will knelt under the tree. The girl placed the flower in his hand. He smiled unguarded. The camera caught it, but even if it hadn't, the moment was undeniable. No one in the barbershop spoke for a while. Then from the corner, the old barber, the one who'd seen governments rise and fall, who had watched his neighborhood change 100 times over, let out a quiet breath and said, "He didn't just speak to Will." The young men turned to listen. "He spoke to all of us who've been laughed at for being quiet." One of the boys, arms crossed, nodded slowly. "He didn't clap back. He didn't get loud." "No," the barber replied, eyes still on the screen. "But he made the world listen anyway." They didn't watch the rest of the clip. They didn't need to. They'd seen enough. And as the afternoon sun cast long streaks across the cracked linoleum floor, the men in that humble barbershop sat in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because they had just witnessed something pure. In a world that often rewards noise, they had seen the power of quiet, and it had changed something, even if only inside. The afternoon sun had slipped beneath the treetops, leaving amber light slanting across the embassy study. President Ibrahim Traoré sat at his desk, not with policy papers or security briefings, but with a small stack of personal mail that had been vetted, sorted, yet still felt unexpectedly intimate. Most envelopes carried the eager loops of children's handwriting or the formal strokes of dignitaries. One, however, was different. Thick ivory paper, addressed in a neat, elegant script he recognized from magazine covers and red carpet snapshots. He slit the envelope, unfolded a single sheet, and read, "Mr. President, you didn't clap back. You calmed the world. You taught that strength can be silent. With gratitude, Jada Pinkett Smith." No elaborate paragraphs, no self-justification, just 3 lines that distilled the moment better than 1,000 commentaries. The ink, deep blue, had bled slightly at one corner, as if penned in a hurry or held a little too long between thoughtful fingers. Traoré leaned back, letting the words settle. He pictured Jada, an actress accustomed to navigating both praise and scrutiny, choosing, in the noise of trending feeds, to sit at a desk, pick up a fountain pen, and handwrite a message to a stranger. That, he thought, was its own kind of silence, a quiet rebellion against the instant, forgettable swipe of the digital age. A soft knock interrupted his reflection. His aide peeked in. "Sir, the ministerial briefing is ready." "Give me 5 minutes," Traoré said. The door closed again. He reached for a slim, leather-bound notebook he kept for moments that needed storing rather than broadcasting. Between notes on budget meetings and sketches of rural clinics he hoped to build, he slid Jada's letter, pressing the fold flat with tender exactness. It joined Muna's childlike scrawl and Marcus's careful handwriting, testimonies that leadership was measured not only in GDP curves or security reports, but in the quiet echoes left in ordinary lives. He closed the notebook and let his palm rest on the cover. Around him, the embassy hummed with its usual urgency. Phones ringing, keyboards clacking, distant voices discussing trade or aid or security. Yet inside those pages lay a different map of impact. A girl with leukemia rediscovering her smile, a bullied boy finding steadiness in silence, an actress half a world away recognizing that a single calm sentence could redirect a global conversation. Traoré stood, slipped the notebook into his inside pocket, and glanced at the fading light out the window. Somewhere, children were finishing their lessons under tin roofs. Farmers were herding goats along dusty tracks. And perhaps Will Smith, sitting in a guest compound outside the city, was watching the same sunset with a less guarded heart. He straightened his white shirt sleeves, inhaled, and stepped toward the door. The world still expected decisions, signatures, security protocols. But he would carry into that meeting the quiet strength named in Jada's letter. Strength that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And when night fell and the noise settled once more, he knew he would open the notebook again, not to reread, but to remember why the noise must sometimes give way to the hush that heals. By the end of the week, the 90-second clip had sprouted subtitles in more than a dozen languages. Mandarin characters gliding beneath Traoré's calm face, Arabic script unfurling right to left, Portuguese captions punctuating every measured pause. Volunteer translators competed to upload fresher, cleaner versions, each insisting the nuance of carry power must not be lost. The algorithm obeyed. It pushed the video into timelines far from English-speaking feeds, where it bloomed anew. On a drizzly Sunday in Salvador, Brazil, a modest hillside church projected the clip onto a whitewashed wall in place of the usual hymn lyrics. Parishioners, some barefoot, others in Sunday whites, watched Will's tear and the president's unhurried reply. When the lights came back on, the pastor closed his Bible and spoke only one line. "We don't need louder speeches. We need louder silence." A hush fell, deeper than any amen he had ever summoned. Across 12 time zones in Kyoto, a middle school ethics class gathered around a smartboard. Their teacher paused the video at Traoré's still expression and asked in Japanese, "Where does his strength come from?" Hands rose slowly. One student said it wasn't the words but the space between them. Another suggested drawing graphs of heart rates before and after hearing the quote. They spent the rest of the period mapping silent courage on scrap paper instead of reviewing for exams. Southward in Ghana's Ashanti region, under corrugated iron roofing that pinged with afternoon rain, a civics instructor wheeled in a clattering TV cart. He played the video twice, then turned down the volume and replayed it with only captions. "Watch his shoulders," he urged. "Notice how calm holds more weight than anger." Later, students were asked to write a paragraph on a time they chose quiet over noise. Many had never written so long in English. That day, every sheet came back full. Online, the phrase "louder silence" morphed into a hashtag carried by poets, gamers, climate activists, street vendors, voices that rarely shared the same digital space. Musicians sampled the line over lo-fi beats. Mindfulness apps clipped it into daily affirmations. A sports commentator quoted it after a tense playoff game, marveling that a stadium of 50,000 could fall mute in shared awe. Inside policy circles, pundits tried to reframe the moment as a soft power victory or a masterstroke of media strategy. But each time someone attempted to turn it into partisan leverage, the public pushback was swift. Let this remain human. The clip itself seemed to repel cynicism the way oil repels water. And through it all, Ibrahim Traoré kept working, signing agricultural grants, touring clinics, slipping quietly into classrooms to ask children what they needed. Yet everywhere he went, someone would repeat his own words back to him, half in gratitude, half in reminder. "We don't need louder speeches." He would nod, smile, and finish it for them, softly. "We need louder silence." And in each corner of the world where that echoed, another pocket of stillness opened, large enough for reflection to enter, small enough for a single voice to feel heard. In a modest village just outside of Ouagadougou, where the wind carried the scent of dust and wood smoke, a new wing of the primary school had recently opened. It wasn't grand by global standards. No marble floors, no high-tech installations, but it was clean, sunlit, and full of books. Shelves, hand-carved by local artisans, lined the walls. A soft breeze fluttered the lace curtains hung by the village mothers. Above the door, in bold but graceful letters, a hand-painted sign read, "The Quiet Voice of Truth Library." It had been the teacher's idea, supported by the village elders and parents alike. After seeing the video, after hearing the president's words ripple through airwaves and hearts alike, they decided the next generation of leaders, those sitting cross-legged on mud floors with pencils behind their ears, deserved a space not just to learn facts, but to understand values. Inside, the first display wasn't about alphabet letters or math tables. It was a quote, framed and placed at eye level for a child. "We don't wear power, we carry it." On a quiet afternoon, a little girl named Sira tugged at her mother's hand as they stepped inside the library for the first time. Sira's sandals were worn thin, her uniform slightly too large for her small frame, but her eyes lit up at the sight of the shelves, the sunlight, the quiet reverence of the space. She led her mother slowly around the room, whispering the titles of books she couldn't yet read but wanted to one day. Then she stopped in front of the framed quote, her fingers brushing the edge of the glass. Turning to her mother, she whispered, "This is the place he taught me I could be strong," without shouting. Her mother knelt, hugged her close, and nodded without a word. Outside, the world buzzed on. Trucks rolled past, roosters crowed, radios played, but within those four humble walls, something sacred had taken root. Not just a tribute, not just a name, but a sanctuary, a place where silence wasn't an absence of sound, but a presence of meaning, and in that silence, children were beginning to find their voices. In a quiet New York studio, the lights were softer than usual. Will Smith appeared unannounced on a talk show. No entourage, no punchlines, no script. He sat down, adjusted the mic, and spoke. Not with charm, but with weight. "He didn't just look at me, he saw me," Will said, voice cracking. He talked openly about his father, his anger, his absence, and the silence it left behind. About the roles he'd played, not just in films but in life. The peacemaker, the entertainer, the man always smiling even when broken inside. For the first time in 3 decades, Will stopped performing. He started revealing. And in that stillness, millions felt something shift. Later that night, from a quiet hotel room, Will opened his laptop. No publicist, no draft. Just a few honest lines. "Mr. President, I've spoken to the world, but now I want to speak with you, not as an actor. As a man." Traoré received the email early the next morning while reviewing village infrastructure reports. He read it once, then again. He closed his laptop and told his aide calmly, "Let him come. Let him see where real truth grows, not in palaces, but in pain." 3 days later, in front of a small youth center in Burkina Faso, 2 men stood side by side, one in a plain white shirt, the other no longer needing a mask. Will stepped forward. The crowd, mostly local teens, watched in reverent silence. "He showed us what dignity looks like," Will said. "Not when the world applauds, but when it listens." Then Traoré spoke, his voice steady but soft. "We don't heal by mocking. We heal by recognizing the wounds in each other." No cheers erupted, just a soft rustle of wind, gentle applause, eyes glassy. It wasn't a climax, it was a beginning, a seed planted, not in noise but in stillness. And the world for once paused, just to feel it grow. There are stories that entertain us, and then there are stories that awaken something deeper, something human. The journey between Will Smith and President Ibrahim Traoré isn't just a tale of a viral moment. It's a quiet revolution of the heart. At first glance, it began like any other talk show banter, light, humorous, a harmless jab. But when President Traoré responded, not with anger, but with dignity, the entire tone of the moment changed. He didn't match the joke with a sharper one. He didn't perform. He simply carried the truth. And somehow that stillness was louder than anything said before it. What touched me most was not just the words spoken, but the ripple they created. A terminally ill girl smiling again, a bullied boy in Harlem finding strength in silence, a celebrity learning to put down his mask and speak from the soul. In a world often obsessed with noise, louder voices, stronger opinions, flashier images, this story reminded me that real power doesn't need volume. True strength lies in restraint, in grace, in listening. President Traoré's quiet leadership didn't just change Will Smith. It reminded all of us that humility can be powerful, that silence can be healing, and that every act of gentleness is a seed we plant in someone else's life, even if we never see it grow. This story is also a mirror. It asks us to look inward. Are we listening more than we speak? Are we responding with ego or with empathy? Are we trying to impress or to understand? And perhaps most importantly, what does it mean to be strong in a world that often confuses strength with dominance? I believe we need more stories like this, not because they go viral, but because they remind us who we are and who we can still become. In the end, it wasn't the applause that mattered, but the silence that followed. Because in that silence, something sacred was heard. Truth without armor, compassion without condition, and strength without performance. So now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone's calm response changed you more than any loud reaction ever could? Let's start a conversation in quiet strength. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.